Next, I'm going to talk about our group's potential issues. We initially had 8, which was a little too much to include in our presentation, so we came up with 3 similarities between the 8 potential issues. The first being catcalling's protection under free speech and how that comes into play. 2, how much of a role psychological trauma plays in the discussion. And 3, if laws regarding catcalling were to be enacted, if certain demographics would be more affected than others. So first, the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment. So the First Amendment includes freedom of speech. Now, the First Amendment does not, there's certain things that it does not include. And included in that is fighting words, hate speech, speech that incites violence, threats, and many more, but those are the most important to note in this discussion, because catcalls are currently not categorized as fighting words. However, in the discussion on both sides of the argument, people and scholars have used catcalls as fighting words to support their claim, but officially catcalls are not understood as fighting words, so we just have to take that into account in this discussion. However, whether catcalling violates the First Amendment or not, that is an important question in this discussion. So lawyer, Thomas Jefferson Law Review lawyer Bunkozel Chun, in a 2011 article, stated that because of catcalling's negative effect on women, it should be considered a violation of free speech under fighting words, defining fighting words as abusive language that inflicts injury and incites an immediate breach of peace. Now, on the other side of the argument is based off of the Brandenburg v. Ohio and Mattal v. Tam court cases that we discussed earlier, where the Supreme Court has in the past upheld discriminatory and hateful speech as long as the speech does not incite or intend to incite violence or harm, which is the key in that on that side of the argument. Second is whether or not psychological trauma plays a role in catcalling, and if that should lead to catcalling being made illegal, or if there's no psychological trauma with catcalling. So once again, there are 2 sides to the argument. On one side, the side that psychological trauma does play a role, this side talks a lot about sexual objectification and the negative consequences with women's psychological well-being after being catcalled or sexually harassed, which sexual harassment, sexual objectification, stranger harassment, all of these things our group thought were kind of the same thing, but they're actually very different, and we struggled with that in our research to decipher what was the same, what was different, what we could kind of lump together. So this is where these lines are kind of blurred, but we get kind of the same idea. So sexual objectification is when a person's body is broken up and treated as an object. And so with catcalling, that's sort of what happens. Women are taken to be valued as their physical appearance or their sexual function for others' consumption, which in this case would be the catcaller. So some research does show that sexual objectification leads to things like depression, anxiety, disordered eating, which we all know is very, very valid. NYU psychology professor Emma Rooney even created her own term to call catcalling microaggressions, which repeated exposure to this could lead to psychological trauma. And lastly, scholars from the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Davidson, Gervais, and Sherd, in 2015 did a big study about stranger harassment, which I noted earlier isn't exactly catcalling. It does have its differences, but it's important to note that in their study, stranger harassment led to women's body surveillance, which is like constant body monitoring, body shame, and other safety concerns, which definitely fits into the idea of psychological trauma having a role in catcalling or stranger harassment. So on the other side of the fence is that psychological trauma plays no role, and with this argument, it relies a lot on the perception of the victim of the catcall or the harassment. So in this portion, it has to do a lot with different factors that could contribute to the perception of the victim at that time. So how the victim perceives the act of catcalling could vary anywhere from the harasser themselves, so the age, the physical attractiveness of the harasser, whether the harasser is accompanied by other people, maybe friends, maybe just other people on the street. That has an effect on the perception of the victim. The setting, so the location, maybe the time of day, whether it's day or night, that could have an effect on the perception. The victim themselves, whether they're alone or accompanied by others. And the big one is the context of the situation. So scholar Kimberly Fairchild in 2010 stated that based on the context of the situation, some women interpret lustful comments in public as compliments instead of in a negative way. So this just goes to show that it's hard it might be hard to claim that psychological trauma has a role when there are so many different factors dependent upon the victim's perception of the catcall, which once again just blurs the lines and makes the conversation really interesting and a little confusing. And so third is the discussion of whether catcalling were to be made illegal, if certain demographics would be affected by catcalling being a law. And so on one side of the fence we have the argument that because minority men in lower socioeconomic status already have a target on their back as being the biggest offenders of catcalling, that this just further perpetuates the problem, and that while that's happening to the minority men, the white male privilege is being strengthened through this catcalling gap, as quoted by Kay Heimovitz from the Manhattan Institute. And then also, Connor Friedsdorf is a writer for the Atlantic newspaper. He talks about how if law enforcement were to be cracked down, that this would affect neighborhoods of lower socioeconomic and minority people, and that's where the patrolling would happen, and that this would just, like I said earlier, further perpetuate the problem that already exists with minority men, and that's why they're arguing on that side that the minority, lower socioeconomic status males are a more affected demographic if this were to be a law. And on the other side is that there is no demographic that's more targeted than the others, in that white men engage in street harassment just as much as minority men. And this was proven, I guess you could say, by Liliana Segura, which she's a contributor for the online journalism publication The Intercept, where she states that up in New York, that white men were just as prevalent to street harass and catcall as minority men, and that the issue is not just with a certain demographic, it's could be various demographics, and that if this were to be enacted an illegal, if catcalling were to be made illegal, that white men who engage in street harassment might not be patrolled in the same way as minority men. However, she still stuck true to that white men do also engage in street harassment and catcalling just as much as minority men.